Welcome to Midas Touch Legal AF with Court Accountability Action. I'm Alyssa Bowen, and I'm here today speaking with Evan Vorpahl. He's True North Research's Director of State Courts and Democracy. And I'm lucky enough to get to work with Evan, who has such deep knowledge of the attacks on our courts and other key institutions every day. It's great that we get to talk to you today, Evan, because you have such a wealth of knowledge on the anti-democratic attacks on our state courts. And there's an important judicial election November 4th in Pennsylvania. So I think it's really timely that we're talking to you today. Can you tell us a little bit about what that election's about?
Yeah, and thank you so much, Alyssa. I'm really excited to be here. So, on November 4th, three Democratic justices on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court are facing a retention vote. This means that voters' options are yes or no to retain each of these justices on the state's highest court. Justices in Pennsylvania are elected to 10-year terms. At the end of their term, they face these up or down retention elections. A few other states have systems similar to this for their courts, and these elections tend to not draw a lot of attention, or overall in the past, they were, not very contentious. And actually, only once in Pennsylvania have voters rejected a sitting justice, and that was in 2005. So it's historically been incredibly rare for voters not to retain just these judges, but we're in like a totally new era right now in America, and certainly in the state courts landscape. These state court elections across the US have been getting increasingly politicized, and judicial elections are now awash in dark money. Earlier this year, for example, in Wisconsin, a state Supreme Court race saw an unprecedented $100 million in spending. That just shattered all previous records for spending in a judicial election. So it's really hard to say what might happen here. This race in Pennsylvania has already been seeing a lot of spending from billionaire mega donors and far right interests. And their interest is to not retain these judges so that they can capture the court and ultimately lock in permanent structural control in the state. Um,
That's
so yeah,
terrifying.
yeah. So these three justices were elected in 2015. That year, the court actually flipped from Republican to Democratic control, and the state's been a huge target ever since. They issued a number of huge rulings that protected Pennsylvania's access to the ballot, mail-in voting, abortion rights, and they ruled in the majority that actually struck down Pennsylvania's unfair partisan gerrymander maps in 2018. So it's a 5-2 Democrat control in the court, and any justice not retained would create a vacancy for Governor Shapiro to fill until an election that would be held in 2027.
That
Um,
sounds like good news. Is that good news?
so actually, not quite, because those appointments would be subject to a two-thirds Senate confirmation. And it's, very, very unlikely, especially because Republicans actually have a majority in the Senate. Um, so if these three justices are not retained, the court would likely be deadlocked at 2-2 for 2 years, creating a lot of issues in the state.
Mm.
And then it would lead up to like a pretty contentious 2027 election. One of these justices is 73 years old. They face mandatory retirement in 2 years. So there will be one race, I believe, in 2027. Um, yeah.
So you mentioned there's been unprecedented spending in the last few years. Why do you kind of alluded to some of this, but why do you think that might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think really since Citizens United, we've seen a huge uptick in spending in politics in general. And, state courts have really started to become very, very politicized since then. And there's been a lot of money pumped into these races. I think right now, a huge issue is redistricting. And the right wing operatives in Pennsylvania, in this race in particular, have been pretty open about why this court matters for locking in maps. Trump himself also posted on social media Sunday, um, you know, talking about a bunch of misleading smears against these judges, and including that they, interfered in the 2020 election by refusing to overturn this election. And he also mentioned gerrymandering. He claimed that these judges gerrymandered the maps, when in reality, in 2018, these three justices were in the majority that actually struck down a unconstitutional gerrymander. Um, to give you a sense of how unfair that map was before this court intervened, in 2012, for example, Pennsylvanians cast 80,000 more votes for Democratic U.S. House candidates than Republicans, but Republicans still won a 13-5 majority.
Wow.
Um, yeah, and one of the groups responsible for this extreme gerrymander, the Republican State Leadership Committee, is actually running anti-retention campaign right now. hoping to capture this court ahead of redistricting so that they can pass these unfair maps.
This is really interesting. I want to just like dig into this a little more. So you mentioned RSLC.
Mhm.
Who's behind that, and who's behind some of the other efforts to attack fair and just judges on state supreme courts?
Yeah, and yeah, like I said, kind of over the past decade and a half, we've seen a huge shift in these state court elections, and that's become, even it's become even more notable, I'd say, in recent years, like Wisconsin I mentioned. We issued a report last year, actually, at True North Research, where we've documented the role of Leonard Leo in the Federalist Society, who have undergone a decades-long campaign to target these state supreme courts. The reason I mentioned Leo is because one of his groups, the Concord Fund, is one of the top funders to the Republican State Leadership Committee. And that group, through its Judicial Fairness Initiative arm, has been one of the top spenders in state Supreme Court elections. Yeah, you may recognize Larry Leo as the he's kind of the central figure in the long-term campaign to capture both state and federal courts. And he's just played a singular, extraordinary role in, getting his allies powerful jobs as judges, state attorney general, and they've used that power to block abortion access, assail equal rights, target the separation of church and state, attack renewable energy, and more. And he also handpicked a lot of Trump's, federal judicial nominees.
Hmm. And he's the man behind the takeover of the far right takeover of our Supreme Court as well, right?
Yeah, he is. And actually, during the Ketanji Brown Jackson hearing, we issued a different report where we tallied him as raising $600 million dollars to capture the U.S. Supreme Court, and that was between 2014 and 2021. Um, what wasn't revealed at the time was that actually that year he also received a $1.6 billion trust via the Marble Freedom Trust for Leo control. So, it looks like we're seeing now over $2 billion that Leo is helming, and he supports an extremely regressive agenda, and targeting Roe has been one of the top items of his for a long, long time.
Mhm. Can you speak a little bit more about that and why Pennsylvania and other state Supreme Courts are sort of becoming a target after the overturn of Roe?
Yeah, so I guess in 2022, the Roberts Court basically um, undid Roe v. Wade, and they pushed it to the states, and these state supreme courts, um, they have the final say for a lot of our rights in these states, and people don't really pay attention to them that much, but they are extraordinarily influential and they're really important. They're kind of the last line of defense in a lot of these states that
Mhm.
have really reckless right-wing legislatures. And in Pennsylvania in particular, this court has, protected the right to abortion. They've protected fair maps. They've protected access to the ballot, mail-in voting. So this court has really sort of stood up to some of these worst attacks on our rights, and that's why it's a target. That's why these right-wing interests want to capture it so that they can,
Impose
start
their.
unwinding our rights. Yeah.
Um, who are some of the other actors besides Leo's network that are coming for state courts?
Yeah. So I think one of them is Dick Uihlein. He's not so much active in Pennsylvania this year, but he has a group that's been extraordinarily influential in recent years at the state level. Um, Together with his spouse Liz, Dick Uihlein, he's been, spending millions to win elections for state judges, but also like he's backed a lot of legislatures who've taken extreme positions, opposing abortion, backing insurrectionist groups, and he's waded deep into these efforts following Roe v. Wade. Fair Courts America, which is the group that he funds for state court battles. It's actually led by a man named Andrew Wynn, who's the former leader of RSLC's Judicial Fairness Initiative. And
Well, the
soon after
revolving
that,
door happening here.
yeah, and actually soon after, that group was founded, Andrew Wynn said he was very, very excited about the reversal of Roe, and it was leading some of their work on the state courts.
Are we seeing any of these groups pour money into attacking the retention of these judges in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so I mean, one major player that is very involved in Pennsylvania is Jeff Yass. He's Pennsylvania's richest man. And compared to Koch, compared to Leo, compared to Uline, he's a little more of a relative newcomer on the scene. And he's typically been involved in funding school privatization groups, although he's been really increasingly cozy with MAGA. His net worth is over $65 billion. This is not somebody who is a normal person like us, and he probably doesn't have the best interests of an average Pennsylvanian in mind. This year, he gave Trump's super PAC $16 million, and it's been reported that he's one of the funders of Trump's, $250 million ballroom project. He's also the largest U.S. investor in TikTok's parent company. So Jeff Yost, it's kind of a shell game with his groups, but there's a network of groups tied to Jeff Yost that he funds that have been very, very active in Pennsylvania. He spent $4 to $5 million in the state Supreme Court race in 2023. And so far this cycle, we've seen about $5 million in spending from him, although it could be certainly much higher. And what is sort of like disgusting from what I've seen of these groups is like, there's this new shell group called Citizens for Term Limits, and they're running really, really misleading ads claiming, fight for democracy, term limit the Supreme Court to force an election. They're kind of hopping on this and co-opting this pro-democracy messaging in order to support a MAGA agenda. They're likening this state Supreme Court to the U.S. Supreme Court, even though this state Supreme Court has often stood up for rights and stood up for democracy. So they're really trying to muddy the waters.
Wow. What are the stakes? What do you think might happen if we see the retention, these judges not retained? And then what do you think the stakes are for that?
Yeah, well, I mean, going back to sort of the gerrymandering thing, Steve Bannon recently gave a really, discussing interview where he said, we need to get the House in a situation that's permanently defendable by the MAGA movement. And I feel like this could be part of that agenda. They want to lock in these state Supreme Courts so that there is no impediment to these really, really unfair maps that we've seen Republican state legislatures drawing. And Trump himself said that he feels, quote, entitled to 5 seats. He's been telling states that he wants them to gerrymander ahead of schedule, which is completely unprecedented. And a lot of these states are taking that up. So I think Pennsylvania is another, they want to control this court so that they can draw unfair maps and lock in this advantage. And if these judges aren't retained, there's going to be a huge election in 2027, and Republicans could potentially flip that court ahead of the 2028 election. And this court in 2020 stood up to Trump's attempts to overturn that election. There'll certainly be a lot of litigation if this is close then.
Well, yeah, this election has flown under the radar, I think, for most people. So thank you for speaking to us about this. It seems like a massive deal. It could have huge implications for the rights of people in Pennsylvania and honestly, all Americans as we head into 2028 and beyond. So thank you so much for speaking with us today, Evan.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alyssa.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.